Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I actually want to take a break from the typical lore episode and talk about a game that I played recently. And yes, I do realize that technically I've taken a break from the format for the last couple episodes talking about Elden Ring, but get off my back. And honestly, I was having trouble trying to write an episode because all that's on my mind is Elden Ring, Dune, and Laika, Aged Through Blood. So that's what I want to talk about, Laika. But what is this game and why exactly do I want to talk about it? Well, I want to talk about it because it's potentially one of the most profound experiences I've had playing a game in quite some time, and honestly, it's the best Metroidvania that I've played since Blasphemous, probably. And between you and me, I actually like Laika more, which is probably in itself pretty blasphemous, right? Currently, at the time of writing this, it has just over 3,000 reviews on Steam, most of which are positive after almost 1 year of being released. And that's not a small number by any means, but I think that this game deserves much more attention than it's getting. And if I can convince one of you to play this game, then I feel like I've done my job. I'm going to split this episode up into two portions. The first is going to be sort of a review of the game, an overview of the gameplay and story, and be spoiler-free. Anything I talk about is going to be seen in the trailers and screenshots on the Steam page, so I urge you to take a moment to listen to this portion, buy the game, play the game, then come back for the back half of the episode where I talk about the story and how it impacted me with full spoilers. I'm really excited to talk about this game, so I just want to get right into it. But before I do, please remember to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it, or subscribe if you're on YouTube. Remember that you can leave a comment or email me if you have something in particular that you want to hear about. And there is still merch available, so get it while it's hot. All the information is on my social media. But anyways, on to the subject of today's episode. Laika, Aged Through Blood was released on October 19th, 2023 by Brainwash Gang and published by Thunderful Publishing. If you're anything like me, you've probably never heard of either of these. But now that I've played the game, I definitely have my eye on both of them. It is the story of a tribe oppressed by occupant forces and the personal story of a mother coyote warrior who descends on an endless path of vengeance to take back what her people lost. And you heard that right, a Motorvania. There are a lot of things that set this game apart from others in the genre, but I think this is probably the most polarizing aspect. Instead of trudging around a dank castle or spaceship on foot, like in most Metroidvania titles, you take control of Laika, the mother coyote that was mentioned before, as you traverse a wasteland on your motorcycle. You can get off occasionally to go inside buildings and interact with the hub area, but for the most part, the game takes place on your motorcycle where you can move forward, stop, and tilt your bike left or right, kind of like in the Trials games, if you remember those. Mastering this movement on your bike is the most important mechanic in the game because, if you remember from the description, you're on a warpath of vengeance, which means that you have a full arsenal at your disposal, which you use from the comfort of your bike seat. As you go through the wasteland rootin', tootin', and shootin', you have to backflip to reload your guns and front flip to reload a parry, which you can activate just before a projectile hits you to send it flying back to the one who fired it. Now, if you're anything like me, then you're already sold on the base premise of the game. A Western-themed Metroidvania where you shoot enemies while doing flips and tricks on a motorcycle. That is genuinely one of the coolest things I've heard of in a long time. And I think that it's the most original and interesting thing to happen in this stale genre for a long time. While this premise had me whipping out my credit card at Mach speed, it's also what most of the negative reviews cite as the main reason they disliked the game or found it too difficult. And I don't really fault them for that, because it's a very hard game to get the hang of. The fact that you're on a motorcycle and have to do tricks to reload your guns and abilities leads to some exceptionally frustrating gameplay on occasion. And honestly, this game is pretty hard. The fact that it's so hard, mixed with the fact that respawns are tied to bone totems, which are essentially bonfires, has led to Laika being branded as a Soulslike. And actually, that's how I heard about this game in the first place. There's a guy on YouTube named Iron Pineapple who plays Soulslikes that you've never heard of, and I really love that series, and that's where I heard of Laika, and I would definitely recommend checking out their channel, looking at their videos. If you like games in the Souls genre, there's a lot of stuff there for you. And I want to get ahead of the Souls-like allegations and go on record and say that I don't think that this game is a Souls-like really at all. I think that most comparisons to the Soul games come strictly from the respawn system, and that when you kill an enemy, you get Viscera to spend as currency, much like the Souls in the Souls games, and you have the ability to parry. And that's really where the comparisons end, and I think it's disingenuous to call this a Souls-like, even though it's just as soul-crushing at times, if not more, than the Souls games. And having said that, I just want to say that I know I do compare this to the Souls games during my review portion and throughout parts of this episode. So even though I don't consider it a Souls-like, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that make it feel like a Souls game, or there are things that are like the Souls games. But just because they have a couple aspects that are the same, doesn't mean they're the same thing. I know some people are going to disagree with me on that, but that's totally fine. But like I was talking about before, the mechanics of the game are its greatest feat and simultaneously its worst trait. I choose to personally believe that it's more of the former, but there are those who disagree, and I find it hard to blame them. I think that it's a lot of fun despite how frustrating it can be, and it makes for a really great action-packed game that makes you feel really cool while playing it. And if you're anything like me, you'll take anything that makes you feel 10% cooler, which riding on a motorcycle, shooting everything that moves, and doing flips and tricks certainly does. It's such a simple concept, mixing the Trials Fusion sort of formula with guns and creating a shooter, but putting that into the Metroidvania formula is something that I would have never considered. And I was even skeptical how they were going to pull it off when I first heard of the game. But that being said, they pulled it off so well. They pulled it off so fantastically, as I'm going to say multiple times in this episode, I'm sure. I will say that having to keep track of your ammo while constantly backflipping to reload does get a little bit exhausting, and sometimes encounters just feel like a maths game. It gets even more frustrating when you factor in that on top of having to carry multiple weapons to cycle through and keep track of ammo, you also have different abilities like the parry, which I mentioned before, which requires the front flip to reload. So you have back flipping to reload your weapons and front flipping to reload your parry, and sometimes this gets a little bit hard to keep track of. And I found myself in situations where I was just panic matching my way through my weapons and hoping that I had enough bullets to deal with the crowd of birds that were shooting at me. And when it came time to reload, I just pray that I didn't accidentally land on my head and have to retry the entire section. And this is going to be kind of my complaint section. I just want to get it out of the way because there are things about this game that do make it a little tough. And it's things that I wish that I knew going into it. And my big complaint is that it's so easy to die from just the constant flipping around. And I know it sounds a bit like I didn't like the mechanics, but that's just not true. My biggest issue is that it's sometimes genuinely hard to tell which way you're facing, especially when you've been mowing through birds and Laika ends up covered in blood, which is super cool and it's a great detail. But at that point, Laika is literally just a red blob with no other real definition. And it's hard to convey this if you haven't seen the art style. But really, the silhouette of Laika is two wheels on the motorcycle and Laika's head looking up. So you have three basically bulbous points, which are the silhouette of the character. And when Laika gets covered in blood, it just looks like a spinning red fidget spinner. And there's really no way for me to describe that any better. But in those instances, it's really hard to keep track of where your head is in relation to the wheels. And sometimes I found myself just flipping up on my end, especially if the camera decided to zoom out because there were a lot of birds in the area or something that it wanted me to see. I often found myself believing that I was going to land right side up after a backflip, only to find out that my wheels were in the air and Laika was just a meat crayon. That sounds kind of wild, right? And I know it's kind of a petty complaint that could boil down to me not paying attention, and that's probably partially true. But in a game where you're constantly scanning the environment and not necessarily staring at your character the entire time, it feels like you're not fully in control of what's happening. Like I said before, sometimes it just ends up becoming panic mashing buttons and hoping that you're going to get through this wave of enemies and just have time to reload safely. And I know, I'm only a few minutes into the episode and I've already been griping about the game for half that time, so let me try to sell you on the game. I just wanted to get my complaints about the mechanics out of the way and let you know that when you go to the Steam page for Laika, you're going to see these reviews calling out the mechanics and calling out the issues that I had with it. It almost deterred me from playing, but there were other factors that made me feel like it was worth picking up. And I want to help someone else overcome that as well, so let's talk it through. And again, I'm not going to spoil anything quite yet. I'll let you know when that happens. Laika takes place in what seems like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. There are ruins of the cities and backgrounds, and no major settlements to be seen of or heard of. You play as Laika, a coyote warrior and mother, who is integral to her tribe's survival because of a unique trait that runs in her family. Laika, just like her mother before her and their mother before them, has the ability to come back after death and communicate with those beyond the veil. Because she can come back from the dead, this means that her bloodline is the only thing keeping her tribe from succumbing to the main threat and antagonist of the game, the birds. So far you have a coyote family and some birds, but not everyone in her tribe is a coyote like Laika. Some are mice, raccoons, walking televisions, and more. However, all of the enemies are birds. It seems like it's kind of wings versus feet in this universe, and it's been going on for a long time. Laika is just continuing a fight that likely started generations ago. Laika takes orders from her tribe leader, and seldom takes parenting advice from her mother in the village. Laika has a child, Puppy, for whom Laika does everything that she does for the sake of keeping her child safe. At the beginning of the game, there's an event where one of Puppy's friends, another child, is taken by the birds and murdered. And this is what starts the events of the game, where Laika is on a revenge-fueled rampage and starts taking the fight to the birds. It seems like before this point, the rest of her tribe was kind of hiding and did their best to stay out of the birds' way. But some rash decisions are made, and this sparks an all-out war, with Laika being at the head of it since she can't die. And so you traverse the wasteland on your motorcycle, seeking ways to get to the birds and completing side missions for those in your tribe as you go. There are several different areas in the game, and each one of them, in typical Metroidvania fashion, is meant to be revisited every time that you get an upgrade so you can get all the goodies and find things that you might have missed the first or even second time going through. The side missions, I think, are a very strong point of the game. I wasn't expecting there to be as many, which extended the game's runtime significantly, which I definitely won't complain about in this instance. But at the same time, it didn't feel like it was being unnecessarily padded out by these side quests. And often they gave you an excuse to revisit an area that you might not have been to for a while, which is great if you acquired an upgrade that would let you get somewhere that you couldn't before, and you might have forgotten to go to that area otherwise. Pretty much all of the quests are just fetch quests, but I don't think that's a bad thing in this instance. And every time you complete a quest, you get to learn something more about the story from the person who you completed the quest for. The exposition that you get from completing a quest really fleshes out the game and makes the universe feel more lived in, which I appreciate. Again, I think that all the side quests were really well done. And of course, no Metroidvania is complete without a host of bosses to fight. And Laika has some really, really great boss fights. Most of the boss fights are on a long stage with plenty of ramps and platforms that you have to maneuver your way around, carefully timing your shots and reloads to make sure that you're making the most of your arsenal. And I think that's where the mechanics really shine. I'm going to be very honest here and say that I don't think I'm particularly great at this game. I don't think I'm bad, per se, but I don't think that there was ever a point where I felt like I was able to breeze through the game. And the boss fights were no exception. They were really tough, and I died several times to most bosses. But not in a way where I felt like I was just slamming my head against a wall because the skill cap was too high, but rather because there was a certain ebb and flow to each boss fight that you kind of have to memorize to a certain extent. Much like a boss in the Souls games, as much as I don't like the comparison. And I thought that it was actually really fun to learn each fight. When I had finally finished the encounter, I felt like I really earned the win because I had to try a few times and really actually try to get it done. And it was really, really gratifying. And that's not to say that I didn't get frustrated at any point during the bosses, but when I got to that point where I was feeling frustration, it was largely because I knew I did something wrong, and it wasn't the game that was at fault. I think that the boss fights were a great standout, and I have some gripes about a couple particular bosses, but I'll save that for the spoiler portion of the episode. The one thing that I will say is that I wish that there were more boss fights. Even little mini bosses along the way would have been a great addition. I just think that the boss fights are really where the game shines and where it feels the most fun, and I wish they included more than just like 6 bosses. And you might expect that given the description of the game, you might get some great metal ambience to rival Doom, but that's not actually the case. I was actually very pleasantly surprised by the soundtrack. My wife was as well, and she would sometimes come in while I was playing to comment on how the music was beautiful, given that the game was so chaotic. And I have to agree. It's hard for me to describe the music as anything other than hauntingly beautiful. You have this lovely acoustic guitar and light percussion with very soft vocals over top, which explain the themes of the game. As you go, you collect more cassette tapes, which expand the songs that you hear on repeat. And That might sound annoying to some, that the songs are just on repeat. Especially if they have vocals, it can get old really quick, but I didn't find that I had that issue at all. The vocals are soft enough, and I feel like it's sung in a way where you kind of have to listen intently to hear what they're saying most of the time, which means that the vocals feel like they're more part of the melody of the song rather than the lyrics being the forefront. And of course, it changes from song to song. Some songs are definitely more ambient, some songs are definitely more lyrically focused. But this is all to say that there was never a point where I felt like I needed to turn off or turn down the music. And right now, it remains one of my favorite video game soundtracks to date. Since I finished the game, I've listened to it a few times while I'm working, and it's just very soothing. It's very nice. It really is beautiful, and it makes the game feel very unique in its style. And I think that's a great segue into the art, which I think is the game's strongest point, despite my gripes earlier. Everything has a very painterly feel to it, and it's very heavily stylized, but not to the point of being overly cartoonish. The colors are bright and bold, and everything has harsh black outlines, almost like a comic book. And I think that style really lends itself well to the Metroidvania genre, where the environment is very important. Since you're on a motorcycle, the terrain that you're going across tends to be a lot of loops and turns and bumps and ramps, so that you can reload at various points. And the art style makes sure that you know what is what and nothing is getting lost in the background. And it seems like a little bit of a silly thing to bring up, but I've played plenty of games where the art style is so stylized that it's hard to tell what's a platform and what's in the background, or even the things that you're able to interact with in the environment versus what's a static object. Laika doesn't really have any of those issues. The art style indicates everything pretty flawlessly, and I think that the art is, again, its strongest suit. Plus, the game is delightfully gory, and I know that's a weird way to describe it, but it's true. Birds explode into viscera when you kill them, and that viscera is collected and used to barter for upgrades, and honestly, it rules. The game itself is pretty brutal with its themes and general gameplay, so I think that having enemies explode everywhere is just a cherry on top. That, and I think the art style somehow goes really well with the music, despite the art being very bold and bright and the music being very subdued and melodic. Like I said, I kind of expected the trend of the heavy metal soundtrack to accompany the game, but I was very pleasantly surprised to find a very chill environment. I think that really helped me keep the rage down when things got particularly stressful and I had to repeat a certain encounter a few times. And really, those are just my general thoughts on the game. I think that the mechanics can be a little bit frustrating, but they really shine in boss fights, and I think that the boss fights are some of the most memorable parts of the game. Traversal through the world is really well done as well, and I think that being on a motorcycle doing tricks and flips really shakes up the typical Metroidvania style and adds something very new and unique. On top of that, the art and music direction are some of my favorite that I can think of in recent history. Like I said, the soundtrack is one of the ones that I listen to on occasion while I'm at work or in the background, and there's something very zen about it, which creates a great dichotomy between the music and the chaotic, gory gameplay, which I think is just fascinating. If it were just based on what I've said so far, I would honestly give this game a 9.5 out of 10. The half point off would just be for some general jank, but that jank is kind of integral to the game, I think, for the most part. It's nothing major, but it does spoil the enjoyment of the game ever so slightly. However, I'm going to start getting into the spoiler territory of the game, and with everything that I'm going to talk about, I think my final score that I would give it is like 8 out of 10. Not that that really matters, numbers are numbers, everyone has their own opinion, and 9.5 to 8 is a pretty big jump down, but there are some issues in the late game that I think are pretty glaring and affect how I ultimately rate and enjoy this game. But most of the gripes I have are probably pretty subjective, so maybe this game would rate higher for you. With that being said, let's get into the meat of Laika and explore it a little deeper. Like I said, this is going to be the full spoiler section of the game, so if you haven't played the game, stop, wait for it to go on sale, do whatever you need, bookmark this episode, and then come back later, because there's a lot of really good stuff about this game, and not that you necessarily need to hear me talk about it, but if you listen to this part without playing the game, you're basically going to understand the entire game, and you won't need to play it. But I think you do need to play it. So, spoiler warning, everything's spoilers at this point, go play the game. So firstly, I just want to talk about the mechanics, and then I'll get into the story. I've already touched on the different mechanics of the game for the most part, but I wanted to go deeper into how everything works and my thoughts on the different weapons and upgrades as well. So to preface this little part, there are two main phases of the game, night and day. During each day, you start in your camp, and you end each night in your camp. Depending on whether it's day or night, there are different people who are active in your camp, so you can only do certain things and interact with certain people during day and night, respectively. This can be a little bit frustrating in some ways because sometimes you want to interact with certain people and you just can't until you start the next day. Like the weaponsmith or the guy who sells you upgrades for your weapon and viscera bags. These guys are only available during the day and aren't there for you during the night. So if you want any upgrades, you have to do it first thing before setting out, because as soon as you return to camp after heading out, it turns to night and they aren't there anymore. It doesn't ultimately matter though, because there's only one portion of the game where time really matters. You could probably go through 100 days in the main game, and I don't think it would make a difference at all. So really, you can start and stop days as you want. So initially, I took this as a pretty big gripe, but I've kind of changed my tune on it because, like I said, it doesn't really matter. If you want to go upgrade your guns, just end the day, start another day. It doesn't really matter except for in the late game. But that being said, I actually like that there's a day-night cycle in the game. It kind of changes the pace of the game every once in a while, and it makes it feel a little bit more alive, especially because there are different things happening in the day and night. And that kind of brings us around to the upgrade system. Like I said, there's a guy who basically sells you bags for weapons and viscera, and his name is Zoot. The weapon bags are pretty self-explanatory. They make it so you're able to carry more weapons. You start with 2 bags, one for your revolver and an initial empty slot, and you end up with 4 weapons that you can carry in total. I think that this system is pretty great, and it's not terribly hard to get up to the maximum number of bags if you kind of grind out resources day to day. And I maxed out my bags before I even had 4 weapons to carry. The viscera bags are a little different in that you lose a bag every time you die, and you have to go back and collect your bag to get your viscera back. It's like collecting souls in a Souls game, again, as much as I don't like the comparison. And you can get up to 8 bags in total, which I think is really overkill, because if you're dying more than 8 times without collecting your viscera bags, I think that you need to focus on getting better at the game. There are enough respawn points throughout the game that I don't think I've ever lost more than 2 at a time, but I guess it adds a layer of security for someone who might not be great at these kinds of games, but I do think that that's a little bit overkill. Then you have the weapons themselves, which can be purchased from Zoe, along with a number of upgrades for each gun. That includes more ammo per reload and reducing the angle that you have to flip in order to reload, which can be really useful. Because if you don't have to do a full flip to be able to reload, you can kind of get more bang for your buck. There are 6 weapons that you can collect in total, which means that since you can only carry 4 at a time, you have to make sure that you're bringing the right tool for the job. However, this is where another one of my complaints comes in, and it's that you start with the revolver, then you get the shotgun, then the crossbow, or you can get the crossbow, then the shotgun, then the machine gun, and finally the sniper rifle and rocket launcher. The revolver is always going to be a mainstay, in my opinion. When it's fully upgraded, I think it's one of the most versatile weapons in the game, and there's no reason not to use it as your main weapon. The shotgun is partly used for traversal. Yes, you heard that right. When you shoot the shotgun, it pushes you a little bit in the opposite direction that you shot in, meaning that you can use it to give yourself a little jump or a little bit of extra distance if needed. And this mechanic is actually used and encouraged to get around to certain areas before you get the dash much later in the game. So you have 2 weapon slots, which you're not reasonably going to give up, the revolver and the shotgun, which means that you have 4 more weapons to choose from and only 2 slots. The machine gun trivializes boss fights and encounters in general, and I'm not joking when I say that I beat the boss in probably less than 15 seconds because of the machine gun. I didn't need anything else, and once you get the machine gun, the game is just way too easy if you use it, even when it's not upgraded. It's really strong. So I made a very specific point of not using it except for in boss fights. So why wouldn't you use that as your 3rd weapon slot? Like if you're having trouble, if you don't want to just use your revolver to get through a fight, like I did in most boss fights, then you can just very quickly switch to the machine gun and just get over the boss fight or get over a hard encounter. So then you have your 4th weapon slot and you have your choice of 3 other weapons. And honestly, you're hardly going to use them because the other 3 that are in your inventory are already far more useful than anything else that you get. So it feels like it's kind of moot to have the other selection if nothing is going to even compare to your other 3. So the gripe here is that the machine gun is way too powerful for its own good, and I think that it should be nerfed pretty heavily in the interest of making the other guns viable to use without just hamstringing yourself. But that being said, I think that the weapon upgrade system itself is pretty solid. I wish that the other weapons that they gave you could replace the revolver, shotgun, and machine gun, but in their current state, I have pretty much zero reason to use anything other than those three. I kept the crossbow in my fourth slot because it's great at covering large area with bolts, but I found that the reload speed was tedious enough that I didn't want to use it, which is a great trade-off. And that's something that the machine gun should have, so it's less of a mainstay. If I had to offer a suggestion, I would make it so that you only reload a few bullets at a time for the machine gun, or a couple bullets, because as it stands, it's way too easy just to do backflips constantly and just hold left click. But that's kind of the end of my gripe there. So, to create and upgrade your bags and weapons, you need two things: viscera and upgrade materials. And there are a lot of different upgrade materials in this game. And the costs get pretty steep as you get later into the game. You find different upgrade materials scattered through the wasteland in boxes, and those boxes respawn every time you start a new day. The fact that they respawn means that there are several routes that you can take every day just to get a ton of viscera and upgrade materials just by doing that route. Even if you find it hard enough to get resources out of the boxes, there are plenty of merchants throughout the game that will sell you everything that you need if you have some extra viscera. And all of this is made even easier by the cooking mechanic. On top of the other upgrade materials that you use to upgrade things, there are vending machines and food all over the place that you shoot to collect, just like the resource boxes. With the ingredients, you can cook different recipes that do a number of things, like giving you extra parries, while others give your bike an increased pickup radius for materials. I used that one every single day because it made collecting resources so much easier. And there are ones that increase your combo multiplier, which increases the amount of viscera you gain in combat by having a higher combo, and ones that just give flat percentage increases to resources and viscera picked up. All these buffs have a timer, so they'll eventually run out and you can't just use them indefinitely, but the ingredients are usually pretty easy to find, so it's easy enough just to have perpetual buffs. I personally love this mechanic, and I think it's a great way to be able to customize your experience and give yourself an extra edge where you think you might need it. If you think you use the parry a lot, you can have up to 4 parries. If you feel like you're not collecting materials easily enough, you can upgrade your bike magnet radius. If you really want to grind for some viscera to be able to buy something, then you can just use the flat 15% increase in viscera gained or have the combo multiplier. Both of those things will give you extra viscera, and I think it's great that you can kind of pick and choose what you want to use. The only caveat is that you can only cook at designated cooking areas, which makes sense, which are usually the main bone totems that you can fast travel to and change your loadout at as well. And that brings me to fast travel, which I'm kind of iffy on the execution of. To fast travel, you need to be at a specific kind of totem, like I just mentioned, that you can travel between those specific totems. I think that's a great mechanic, and I think that it makes sense within the game. So to be able to fast travel, you need candles, which can only be made at your mother's home. And to make those candles, you need beeswax, which is a resource that you can find all over the wasteland. I ended up with more candles than I could ever reasonably use, because how often are you really fast traveling between locations? And I think that's perfectly fine. I think that having an abundance of the fast travel resources is much better than it being way too limited. But what I don't think is fine is that you end up with the side quest pretty early on from your mother, and she tells you that there's a pendant that allowed her to travel quickly all over the place and that you should go and find it. This leads you on a wild goose chase, which is pretty much only good for the sake of exposition and Laika's backstory. Every time she tells you where she needs you to go, you experience a memory from Laika's past, and it lets you know the story of her firstborn, who died because of the curse on the women in her family, which I'll get to later. And when you finally complete the quest, somewhere just past the halfway point of the game, you get the pendant. And with this pendant, you can fast travel without the need for candles. And that's kind of where I'm iffy. There are enough resources throughout the wasteland that if you need to fast travel multiple times a day to get side quests done, you'll still probably never use all the candles that you've made. I ended up with dozens extra by the time I got the pendant, and I had hundreds of beeswax just left over to make more candles that I was never able to make. I think that the pendant is honestly unnecessary, and I wish that it was more of a traversal device, like maybe just like a speed boost or something like that, because it makes the whole candle mechanic feel very redundant to me. If candles were more scarce, I might be singing a different tune, but because they're so plentiful, I don't see a reason why the pendant needs to exist at all. And I think that the fact that there's nothing to do with the candles or the wax that you get after you get the pendant makes it feel like a wasted resource. I understand why they wanted to initially limit fast travel to make you go out and explore more, but I don't feel like this was implemented particularly well. I think that either the beeswax should have been more scarce and it should have been harder to make candles, or there should have been more incentive to fast travel, but there just wasn't either of those. Then there are the 2 upgrades that I wanted to talk about, and that's pretty much all that's left, really, for the mechanics, which are the dash and the grappling hook. And I'll start with the dash because I think it's so cool. I think it's awesome. Basically, you can use it once you're in the air or on the ground to dash forwards, and then you need to touch the ground with both wheels to be able to use it again, and that's so you can't just dash in perpetuity. This basically replaces any functionality of the shotgun's traversal abilities because it's far better and much more easily controlled. But I still found myself carrying the shotgun regardless. I don't know why. It's not like it was a particularly great weapon. It was really great for traversal, but somehow I just found myself clinging to it. Maybe it was a comfort thing. But you get the dash pretty late in the game, which means that you got pretty used to using the shotgun to get around. And I think it comes at the right time, and it feels like a really welcome upgrade. It just made combat so much more fun and honestly much easier. And I partially wish that the dash was available just a little bit earlier because of how much I loved using it. The grapple hook, on the other hand, which was really just created to take down the big tree, the home of the birds' popes and religion. And it was honestly only used for that purpose, for that one section where you grapple onto those giant columns to tear them down and topple the floors down to the big tree. But after that, there's literally no purpose to it. I don't think there's a single use for it aside from that one side quest where your goal is to take down statues of important birds throughout the wasteland. Initially, when you get the grapple, you use it to grapple a bomb, which you carry to a rock that you needed to let go of the bomb and shoot to destroy the rock. And you needed to do that to be able to get through this cave. I thought that was a mechanic that might come back at some point, but it never did that I encountered, and I was pretty disappointed by that. I feel like they just needed an excuse to be able to topple the columns of the big tree and didn't have any ideas after that, or there was cut content in the game where they planned to use it more and just didn't, and they couldn't find a way to write it completely out of the game, so they left it in for the big tree portion. But I can't say for sure. I have no idea. I just feel like they could have done it a little bit differently. They should have used it more. Even if they just had the same bomb and rubble situation from when you first get the grapple that I was just talking about, where you have to destroy these things to make better shortcuts or something, right? Even if you could just grapple enemies and throw them around, I think that would be so fun. Like, that should have been included in the game, honestly. Because that would have made it at least useful. So you could, like, grapple an enemy to take them out of the fray and kind of let them go and throw them. I don't know, just spitballing here, but I think that would have been a much better use for it. But it feels like they just kind of forgot that it existed in the last half of the game. And in talking about the last half of the game, I think it's worth talking about the bosses a little bit more. And I think that the first 3 bosses were incredibly well done. 100 Hungry Beaks was kind of a skill check to make sure that you understood the mechanics of the game at that point. And it wasn't too hard at all, considering it's really, really early in the game. But it's a good challenge, and I managed to beat it on my first try. A Long Lost Woodcrawler was in the same vein, where I didn't have too much trouble, but I thought it was a really well-designed boss. I think that A Caterpillar Made of Sadness was the hardest boss in the game, and it's the 3rd boss that you encounter. I also think it's the best designed. You encounter this boss 3 separate times, and each time it had a different shtick that it brought to the fight. So I think the first one, it had rockets that it fired at you, and those rockets would home in on you. The second one, it had poison bubbles, I think, and it added a different mechanic every time to the boss fight. And then when you face it in the final fight, it brought together all of those elements, and it was honestly really hard. It was ultimately an endurance test. You had to just make sure that you memorized the attack patterns and the layout of the map that you're on, and you had to be perfect. I thought it was a little harsh because you really had to be perfect with your shots and reloads, and there was very, very, very little room for error. But like I mentioned before, I think that learning this boss was actually really fun, and overall I thought it was extremely well designed. Anytime that I died, it was because I had a problem. It wasn't because the game was being too hard, it's because I hadn't learned something properly. And I think it was a really great lesson for the game, and it made me better at the game. Then we get to the second half of the bosses, most of which I thought were pretty weak in comparison to A Caterpillar Made of Sadness. A gargantuan swim crab was pretty difficult, but It was in the same vein as a Caterpillar Made of Sadness, where it was ultimately just memorizing the pattern to make sure you could get through it without error. But it just wasn't as good as the former. But it was cool because you kind of traverse up a tree, right? And I thought the map itself was really cool, even if the boss was kind of lackluster. Then you have Pope Melva the Eighth, which was just a shining disappointment in terms of all of the boss fights before it. It was still an interesting challenge. You basically have to dodge the eggs that it shoots out, and then you have to shoot those eggs. And every time you shoot one of the eggs, it splits into 2 eggs. So you end up with like 8 eggs just bouncing around everywhere that will kill you if you touch them. So it really forces you to ration your bullets and make perfect use of the one ramp that was there to make sure that you're reloading and doing everything on time, because you also had a very, very small window to actually damage the boss. And if you didn't damage them in time, they just shot out another egg. So it was a good boss overall, but it wasn't anything special in comparison to the other bosses before it. And again, I'm going to go back to a Caterpillar Made of Sadness because that boss fight was so good. I wish that they had more of that. But I ended up getting the hang of the Pope Melva after a couple tries. And I think I beat it on my 3rd or 4th try, once I kind of understood what was happening. Then there's the 2-beat God, and I have less of a problem with this boss mechanically than I do from a story standpoint, which I'll go over in a minute. But like I mentioned before, I beat this boss in less than 15 seconds or so, and that was all thanks to the machine gun. The boss really just felt like a placeholder for what was supposed to be the real boss, and I was pretty disappointed that it was basically credits roll once you kill him, because I really thought that it was like a phase 1 of a boss, not the actual boss. But it was so easy just to get up in the air and backflip forever in bullet time while using the dash to get away from the second head and keep airborne while you just flip forever and shoot the machine gun. And again, 15 seconds, it was over. And it just felt really disappointing because of the lead up to the fight. It never feels good when the last boss is the easiest. And I'm sure that if I didn't just use the machine gun, it would have been much harder, and I might have actually gotten to see the boss fight. But the fact that you can just bring the machine gun in anywhere and trivialize any fight, I think is a really low point. But regardless. And I think that leads nicely into talking about the story portion, speaking of the lead up to the final fight. And the story is honestly incredibly well done. It's all executed in such a way that you could totally just play the game with the base understanding that you need to kill birds, and everything else is just a set piece in between your trick shots. You don't need to engage with a lot of the story, and I think that a lot of people might not engage with much of the story because it's not really told to you directly. There's definitely some figuring out that you have to do to understand everything in its entirety. And as someone who likes the Souls games, again, really hate that comparison to this game, I think it's a perfectly valid way of telling the story, and I think it's a great method for this game. Not every game does it very well, and not every game is suited for this kind of storytelling, but I think that Laika is. So let's talk about the story for a little bit. And if you've played the game and you're sticking with me at this point, then you know that there's going to be some pretty explicit themes of sexual abuse and harassment. So if you're listening to this and you didn't play the game and you just want to kind of understand the game without playing it, then if that makes you uncomfortable, I would stray away from this portion, because that is really the central theme of this game, or at least one of the central themes of the game. So with that being said, the story starts with, and I believe I mentioned this before, a child named Poochie being murdered by the birds. Poochie's father, Jacob, steals Laika's revolver and goes after the birds at their military base, where he attempts to get retribution in the form of revenge. And this is where you start the game, trying to figure out where your revolver ended up. You find Jacob on the brink of death, and you learn that the birds have started genetic experiments to create monsters, which you can presume that they're building so that they can finish off Laika's tribe. And after defeating one of these experiments, Laika goes back to Jacob, where he succumbs to his wounds and, unfortunately, passes away. This is where the player is introduced to the idea that Laika can communicate with the dead, which is a genetic trait in the women in her family. Along with being able to communicate with the dead for a short period after their passing, the women can also come back from the dead with their bone motorcycle, which they use the bones of their ancestors to make. It's later revealed by Laika that this is an extremely painful process and that one never really gets used to it. She explains that it's like having every cell in your body ripped apart one by one, and then suddenly, just when you can't bear it anymore, it just ends and you wake up back in the world. So this is the central mechanic and plot point in the game. Since Laika can't die, she's the tribe's greatest warrior and the only one who can leave their home during this time to go fight the birds. For everyone else, it's just too dangerous. And any other good warriors that they have, they need to stay back at the camp just in case the birds find them. We learn throughout the game that this immortality doesn't last forever, for only one in the family can possess it at one time. When a child of the immortal first bleeds, as they call it, which is menstruation in this case, and represents the coming of age or maturity, they take the mantle of the immortal and their mother ceases to have the ability to commune with the dead or come back from death. However, it's not as simple as it just being passed down to each child. It turns out that not everyone survives their bleeding, and it's almost a sickness that takes you to the brink of death and then leaves you with a slim chance of survival. It makes sense for an ability that would bring you back from the dead to bring you right to the brink and have you feel that suffering of your own mortality before you're given its powers. But that's all I want to say on the matter at the moment. All of that kind of comes back around. So after putting Jacob's spirit to rest, they have a funeral for him and we're introduced to Laika's child, Puppy, and her mother, Maya. Maya wants Laika to train Puppy, for she is set to inherit the family curse, assuming that she survives her bleeding. And here is where we get one of our main themes, which is a refusal to continue the cycle of violence that surrounds Laika's family. Laika seems to have no interest in training Puppy because, one, she thinks that she's too young, and she wants to prevent Puppy from having the same traumatic upbringing that Laika had by being forced to grow up way too fast. So Laika keeps Puppy at an arm's length from her mother, Maya, who constantly brings up the fact that Laika won't let her come over and visit her house so that she can visit her granddaughter. These themes of trauma and the never-ending cycle of violence are the core themes of the game, in my opinion, and I think that they're done very, very well. At this point, we also meet the elder of the rest of the tribe. The elder is the one who makes all the decisions, and they've decided that they must declare a full-out war on the birds to stop this conflict once and for all. I also mentioned this before, but it really sounds like this has been going on for generations, and everyone seems pretty sick of being at war. It's said that the tribe lived in a different place beforehand, and you can actually go to this place. It's called Where We Used to Live. But they were forced into hiding after the birds attacked it, and so now you are at Where We Live. So, anyways, the all-out war has to be done by making an alliance with a mining town and to go to destroy a lighthouse, which serves as a communications relay for the birds, so that they can go to their main base of operations, as you call it, the Big Tree, to destroy it and hopefully scatter the birds to the wind. And that's pretty much the plot of the game. That is your entire goal. Go to the mining town, go to the lighthouse, go to the Big Tree. Throughout your adventure, you meet a host of strange characters throughout the wasteland. Most of the people that you meet will either give you a side quest or sell you something. And there are very few people who are just set pieces in the game. Some of these characters that you meet are in the mining town, and you get sent on a quest to liberate the town from the birds, who have seemingly ransacked the place and taken it hostage. In return for your cooperation, the mining town will come to your war against the birds. After defeating the boss and confronting those who sent you on the mission, you come to the understanding that there was actually no one left to save and that the birds massacred everyone in the mining town except for those who you spoke to. And this is where we first see Laika's unbridled rage. She threatens to kill them for deceiving her, which seems like a pretty large overreaction, but ultimately spares them as there's no point for more needless bloodshed. On the flip side, we see a little bit more compassion from Laika during her trip to the lighthouse, where she meets Roy, the boat captain who agrees to take her deep into bird territory to destroy the lighthouse. Roy works for the birds, which Laika doesn't seem to understand, but comes to empathize with him after learning that he hates the birds after they killed his wife and 3 kids. But he works for them because he still has to make a living somehow. Roy ends up being killed, which seems to take its toll on Laika, and like I said, we see quite a bit of compassion from her here in this segment, which is a pretty big contrast to the mining town, where we see zero compassion for the ones that the people in the mining town lost. Granted, the people in the mining town were trying to trick her into dying pretty much, whereas Roy was trying to help her the entire time. So you kind of understand why she would have different reactions to both of these situations. And after that, Laika goes to the Big Tree, where it's her goal to topple it down because it would cause havoc amongst the birds. The Big Tree is the birds' religious center, so if it were brought down to dust, that would surely rustle some feathers. Here we meet Arella, who is a member of Laika's tribe who is willingly living at the Big Tree with the birds. Her passion is for architecture, and so where else would someone be who loves architecture other than the oldest, most prominent building in the Wastelands? She loved the big tree, but understood the importance of taking it down, as that would really disrupt the birds, and that would lead to an opening where the war could end. Unfortunately, she couldn't quite wrestle with the conflict within her, as she really, really loved the big tree, and her entire life had been devoted to studying it. And she ended up taking her own life when Laika finishes the job and kills the bird pope, toppling the tree. This is another area where we get to see a bit of empathy from Laika amidst her usual stoic, apathetic self. And I think it's really, really important to show both sides of Laika like this. You see that she is utterly brutal when someone's working actively against her, and she tends to be very cold and reserved as a result of being used throughout her entire life. But then the odd moment comes up where she's able to let her guard down and be who I think she really wants to be. She has plenty of these moments with Puppy, who at this point in the game is really pushing Laika to find Poochie's body, which was stolen away by the birds, so that she can put him to rest. But Laika knows that this isn't really the main goal right now. The main goal is disrupting the birds so that they can take them down, stop the war, and she knows that she can find Poochie's body at any time after that point. However, Puppy doesn't really understand this. And every day she's constantly asking her mother, like, when are you going to find Poochie's body? Have you found it yet? And the answer is, no, sorry, I'll do it tomorrow, every single day. So it's this push that leads to Puppy trying to go and find her friend's body by herself. And because Laika had been so preoccupied with disrupting the birds' communication networks and trying to gain allies for the war, she didn't have time to look for Poochie's body. Laika is eager to get this all over with so she can put down her gun, turn off her bike, and focus on raising Puppy to be different from her and her mother. But unfortunately, again, Puppy doesn't really understand this and ended up heading out on her own journey and ends up getting kidnapped to be taken to Heaven, which is a bird city in the sky where their god supposedly lives. It's during this arc that we see the extent of Laika's brutality when it comes to protecting something that she loves. She would do absolutely anything for her daughter, and that is evident many times in the story before this point. And Laika does, well, heinous things to get her daughter back. And some of that includes killing someone in her tribe who was loosely associated with Puppy's kidnapping. And again, brutally. Not even subtly, like in front of other people in the little bar that's in their tribe. Laika ends up going on this remorseless killing spree to get her daughter back, and it's really hard to watch. Of course, we're on her side. We want her to get Puppy back. But it's still really hard to watch Laika just straight up execute civilians who were, in their eyes, trying to do what was best for everyone. It turns out that the birds up in Heaven were actually looking for the key to immortality. And they knew about Laika and her family curse. And so they figured that the key was in their blood. And so they had a bunch of people in this scheme to abduct Puppy and get her blood, since they weren't likely to get Laika's. We, of course, know that this was wrong, and that Puppy's blood was no use to them since she didn't have the curse, and truthfully, even if they got Laika's blood, the blood has nothing to do with it at all. I think that Laika realized that, and she offered up a vial of her own blood in exchange for Puppy, although that didn't end up happening, and she had to kill yet another person to get Puppy back home safely, which she does. And as hard as this was to experience, this really goes to show how deep Laika's love for Puppy is, despite the fact that she never actually properly named her daughter, which you might have noticed. She just calls her Puppy, which is the equivalent of us naming a child baby or child. Like, imagine you have a kid and you just don't want to get attached to it, so you just call it kid, right? It's the exact same thing. And it's around this arc that we start getting side quests to explain why it is that she never gave her daughter a name. Remember when I mentioned that the side quest where you're being led around the wasteland to get a pendant that replaces the fast travel candles? That's the quest. We learn that Laika actually had several children before Puppy, 8 to be exact, and they all died to the curse. They all succumbed to the fever and pain that happened around their bleeding, so that gives you an idea what the survival rate for the curse is, and it's pretty bleak. And that's not the end of it. It gets so much worse. Through the side quests and numerous other interactions with Maya and the Elder throughout the game, you learn that Laika only willingly had one child, and that was her first. And honestly, it doesn't even sound like she really willingly had the first one, and it might have been begrudgingly because she knew that her child would either succumb to the fever or inherit the curse. She didn't want either of those things, because Laika really wants to break the cycle of abuse that came with the curse. And as long as the curse is persistent, that cycle of abuse kind of just has to happen. It turns out that both her mother and the elder forced her into having more children, and yes, that means exactly what you think it means. So Laika was forced to have 8 more children after her first died to the fever, and this is where you can kind of understand where Laika's trauma comes from, and there is a lot of trauma. That and her mother being abusive while she was growing up, forcing her to use a gun and kill from a young age to prepare her for the role of being the undying warrior before she reached maturity. And that's why Laika never named Puppy. She named her other 8 children, but she didn't have the heart to get attached to another child after so many years of what was honestly torture. It's being forced into having a child and then waiting to see if they die. She didn't want any of these children. They were forced upon her by her mother and the elder so that they would have an immortal warrior to defend the tribe. That's all they cared about, was keeping this curse going, because to the elder, this curse was a blessing. They really took this theme to the extreme, and it left its impression on me, and I think that it was profound in its execution. And I think it's worth noting that all this information that we have is implicit, meaning that they didn't outright say that Laika was sexually assaulted and made to have children, but everything in the writing makes it abundantly clear that this was the case. They don't spell it in black and white, but it's very clear to see that this was the case. This is what happened. And again, you really start to understand what Laika went through in her life to get to this point, and it makes her being ruthless, cold-blooded. It makes it all make sense, right? And so at this point in the story, Laika has Puppy back just in time for her to start bleeding. Whether it was the trauma of her kidnapping or just sheer bad timing, it started happening pretty much as soon as they got back. And this poses a few problems. The first problem is obviously that Puppy might die as a result, like the rest of Laika's children. The second problem, and the bigger problem that they're facing right now, is that they are currently in the middle of a war. Laika had not only just taken out the birds' communication center, but is fresh off of coming back from toppling their religious center and killing their pope. The birds are pissed, and for a good reason, and the climax of the war was basically right in front of their eyes. If Puppy bled before Laika was finished, then that would mean that Puppy would be the one who would be sent out to finish the job with no training. Remember, Laika wanted her to have as normal of a life as she could, and so she didn't train Puppy to shoot a gun or ride a bike. And so Laika had to step away from her daughter, who was deep in a fever. Maya, her mother, stepped in to take care of Puppy while Laika took care of the birds so that she could finish the job before either her daughter died or her immortality ran out. Because if Puppy inherits the curse, then Laika loses it, which means that if she's right in the middle of a battle and she loses her immortality, that's it. She could not even know when it happens, right? And honestly, this is where the game starts feeling a little bit rushed, and it's where it lost some points for me. I really wish that they had fleshed out this section a bit more. And if you're listening and you've played the game, then I would imagine you probably agree with me. If you don't, then I would love to hear from you on why you don't think it was rushed or why you think it was good. I guess good is not a good word because I still think it was good. I just think it could have been better. I mentioned heaven before, the floating city in the sky where the bird's god lives. And this is where it would all end. Laika makes her way there very quickly and is told by one of her comrades that there's a resistance group amongst the birds who are pacifists and want the warring to stop. And I love that they included this into the game because there are hints to it all throughout the game. And it's so good. There's one portion where Laika's looking for Puppy, where she disguises herself as a bird and goes through a slum where she sees signs for the resistance. The members of this resistance all wear white armbands, and they are everywhere, including in the military. And the really cool part, and they didn't have to add this to the game, but they did, is that you actually encounter birds who are a member of this resistance all throughout the game, and you might not even realize it until the end is there. These birds will not shoot at you, despite being amongst groups of other birds who are trying to kill you. Even if you kill all the other birds, you can go right up to those with white armbands, and they won't react to you. They refuse to fire a gun. And again, they're all over the game. I think it's such a great little detail because as soon as it was explained to me that the members of this resistance wear the armband and they refuse to shoot no matter what, I remembered back to all the times when I wouldn't quite kill a bird and I thought I was dead. And because maybe I was in the middle of a reload or maybe I just didn't see them and this bird just wouldn't shoot at me. And I'd be sitting there kind of waiting for it to shoot at me. And it just never did. So I would just kill it and move on. I assumed it was a glitch, but after the revelation that these members are part of a resistance, it was just like a huge aha moment that really, it made the game feel so much better. There's a lot of nuance in the writing like that, and I really have to give kudos to the team because just that little detail alone makes this game so good. Anyways, so Laika is told that the leader of this resistance, Pluck, is going to help her get into heaven. And this is where I start to really disagree with Laika's attitude. I understand that she's been fighting the birds for basically her entire life, and her mother and her mother's mother have been doing the same. I get that there's a deep-seated generational hate here, but even when confronted with Pluck and assured that he's there to help and that he wants the birds to stop the war as much as she does, Laika is still extremely obtuse when dealing with him. To the point where he's guiding her in how to take down certain defenses so she can get into heaven, and Laika is just threatening to kill him the entire time. Literally every single conversation with him ends with, if you do anything funny, you know what happens. And again, I know that a hatred like this kind of trumps any reason, but I was really hoping that Laika would be able to see the other side of it. Laika is a symbol of change and kicking the generational abuse that was forced upon her, and wanted to make a new life for herself and her daughter away from all the hate. And she still can't see eye to eye with a bird who has shown her literally no reason to distrust them other than the fact that they are a bird. I think that's a missed beat, personally. It really feels like all the progress that Laika has made and all the statements that she's made, all the virtues that she stands for, were kind of just dashed away in this last quarter of the game for the sake of it. Like, yes, of course she hates birds, and of course she's going to be skeptical of birds, but you'd think that after several repeated times of one of the birds showing her that they're there to help, telling them how to take down heaven, telling them everything, that she might see the other side of it, that she might be like, okay, not all birds are bad, it's just these fanatics, right? Again, I really think that this is a misbeat. I think that this should have been changed. I think it should have been different. I really think that Laika should have been able to show some compassion here. I think that would have made it feel a lot more complete. I think it would have been a full circle moment, at least for me. That's my opinion. If you have a different one, again, I would really love to hear it, because that's really my biggest complaint with the story in this game. I think that's my only story complaint about the game, is just this last little bit and how this feels. But with the help of Pluck, you're able to get into heaven. It's a very short segment, all self-contained into one area. And once you're able to get up into heaven, Laika immediately gets captured, just plucked out of the air by a claw. And so you figure that you're going to have to escape from heaven. Maybe they take all of your equipment, including your bike, and you have to find a way to get to your belongings before confronting the final boss and taking it all down. But that doesn't happen. You're just unceremoniously dropped into a cage where the two-beat god is making a performance out of killing Laika. And it's basically a public execution of the one who has been single-handedly causing them all of these problems. And not only are you dropped into a cage with their god, but you're there with your bike and all of your weapons as if you were just being dropped into a gladiatorial arena. And after a brief monologue about how the two-beat god is going to bring glory to the birds by killing Laika, and then killing everyone else by way of a tactical nuke called the Egg, you have the final boss fight. After you kill the two-beat god, the Egg is dropped from the cage along with Laika, and that sends them both hurtling down towards the wasteland. I will admit that the following scene is pretty neat. You're free-falling through the air aside a nuke while birds are dropping down, trying to stop you from blowing it up. But you take no damage during this phase, so you don't even have to deal with the birds around you. You can take as many shots as you want, and your only goal is to shoot the crap out of the Egg so it doesn't nuke everyone into oblivion. And of course, as fate would have it, right at this time that you're hurtling towards the ground, Puppy bleeds. And that means that Laika is no longer invincible. In taking out the Egg, she would be condemning herself to death, but the goal was always to stop the birds at any cost, and this was the final cost. It just came at a really bad time. If it happened literally minutes earlier, Laika wouldn't have had to die. And so, in an act of self-sacrifice, Laika forces the Egg to blow up midair, saving everyone but herself in a very poetic ending. And I want to be very clear that I have no problems with the ending. From the moment that they talked about the curse and you find out that Laika has a daughter, I knew that the game was going to end with Puppy inheriting the curse while Laika dies to try to save everyone. I think that's beautiful, and I don't think there's any other way that the game could have ended. My only problem is that the entire ending just seemed rushed. That last segment where you go up into heaven really just feels rushed. And the way I described it might not sound like it, but I really feel like we were robbed of one or two more stages, maybe a couple different bosses. And again, I really think that there should have been some gameplay in heaven where you have to escape from imprisonment. Hell, make it Metal Gear style. That would have been amazing. But other than that, I think that this game was beautifully made. I just have that one gripe with the end bit where I really wish that they fleshed it out a little bit more. I think I ended up with just over 20 hours into this game, which is nothing to scoff at. I really did do pretty much everything in the game, or at least everything that I could. There were things that I missed, but I didn't intentionally miss anything. I completed every side quest that I had. And again, took me about 20 hours. That's not a short game by any means. If you rush the game, you could probably do it in probably 6 or 7 hours, I would imagine. But I really do wish that there was just an extra couple hours, maybe a few hours just to flesh out that last section. It really felt like it was the last third of the game, but they condensed it down to a quarter. But I really don't want to talk too negatively about the game because, again, this is my favorite game that I've played this year, I think. This episode went on far longer than I thought it would, and I'm not sorry about that. This has been one of my favorite games that I've played this year, and it's my favorite Metroidvania in recent history. So if you've made it this far, then you either really love my voice or you've played Laika, Age Through Blood, and you enjoyed it. I can't imagine anyone who played this game and didn't like it for the story. If you disliked it because of the mechanics, I can understand that because it is a little jank. But I personally loved it. I thought it was amazing. But either way, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think that the runtime for this game fell short in the end? Again, that's my big complaint. I want to hear what other people think. Or how about the boss fights? Did you like them? Hate them? Let me know. And if you're someone who's just listening to the episode without having played the game, what do you think? Are you compelled to buy it? Do you think you're going to buy it? Are you not going to buy it? Is this not the game for you? I want to hear your thoughts. And if anyone buys this game because you're listening to this episode, please let me know. I would love to know. You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me or at lordtodeath@gmail.com. If you're using the Spotify app, then there's a comment section attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics. And I really would love to hear from you. And just remember, good games are still being made. Amongst the dumpster fire that is live service games, there are still companies, mostly indie, who are making games because they love what they do and they have a story to tell. There are people who are pouring their life savings and life's work into making these games, and you just have to find them to be able to find the good ones. I'm not saying that every AAA game is garbage, but there are a lot of companies who just don't care about their consumers and are in it for a buck. The folks who made Laika were not like that. This was a game that you can tell there was so much love and compassion put into it, and I am very grateful to have experienced this game. And all you have to do to find good games like this is just dumpster dive through Steam to find these gems. They're out there. And I'll lure you to death in the next one.